Greetings everyone, this is Dominic and today you're tuning in to the Comic Book Report, where we review comic books and graphic novels so you can get an idea of what to read. And today I'm coming to you with another list video. Today we're going to be talking about 10 great comic book reads for fantasy readers. As a lover of genres in general, I find that sometimes it's fun to read comics to taste, and I think there's a lot of people out there who enjoy some good fantasy fiction, and here are a couple great comics I found that are in this genre. Before we jump into the list though, I do want to shout out our channel sponsor, OrganicPriceBooks.com. If you're looking to pick up your own comic book collected edition, I highly encourage you to check out their website. You can find a link for it in this video's description, and if you find something you like on the website, you can even use my code at checkout, TheComicBookReport, to receive $2 off of your order. Please note if you use my affiliate code or link to make a purchase, I will earn a small commission, but it's a fantastic way to support this channel. Thank you so much for considering. Now let's get started with today's list. First on the list today, in no particular order, we have Once and Future by Kieron, Gillen, and Dan Mora. This is a series released by Boom Studios, and frankly, it's one of my favorite modern fantasy comic series I've ever had the opportunity to read. Admittedly, I'm still making my way through the back little bit of this series. I've read the first 3 paperbacks, and I've really enjoyed the ride. This is a contemporary fantasy series where we have fantastical elements, mostly from Arthurian legend or kind of old literature, things like that kind of break their way into our own modern world. It's a really fun kind of action adventure character driven series, and the art from the incredible Dan Mora throughout it, well, it just really helps you to realize this fantastical scape we get between our modern world that's invaded by fantasy creatures, but also this kind of mythical other world that's presented throughout the series. The art is definitely a selling point for me on this series. This is actually the series that turned me on to Dan Mora, who's gone on to do, amongst other things, the current run on World's Finest over at DC with Mark Waid. He's an incredible artist. I really love everything Dan Mora brings to this table, and we get to see him just do so many incredible things throughout this book and this series. It's a really fun one, I think, especially for fans of Arthurian legends, the tales of King Arthur, things like that, maybe Beowulf, some of that old school kind of literature and tales. This is a really great series for you. I think it's so much fun. I think for those that are also a little more literary savvy in general, this can be a very fun series. Really like the characters. I think the action was really interesting. Like I said, the art is beautiful, and Gillen is no slouch either. The prose we get throughout this is fantastic. I love the dialogue. Like I said, the characters are really fun. They're immediately engaging, and they can absolutely hold my interest throughout. There is kind of a hero's journey, reluctant hero kind of narrative as well with the main character in this series, but I like the whole supporting cast of characters and the villains. Very fun series. Definitely check out Once and Future. Next on the list today, of course, if you follow this channel, you've heard me talk about Undiscovered Country by Scott Snyder, Charles Soule, and Giuseppe Camuncoli. This is an Image Comics series that is still ongoing, and it's one of my personal favorites. I think for me, Undiscovered Country sits at that perfect cross-section between fantasy and science fiction, so likely it'll appear on both of my lists, but for here, in the case of fantasy, one of the things I love about Undiscovered Country is we have excellent world building. There's this fantastical sequence of landscapes in this dystopian future version of America, and each of these different realms or zones, they're called in Undiscovered Country, the different kind of partitions of the country, all have a different kind of fantasy landscape. So in the first run here, in this first paperback, the first zone they go to in this future America is kind of this desert Mad Max like wasteland that has all of these kind of monstrous, grotesque, hybridized creatures. It's just a really fascinating look at kind of a dystopian America. There are definitely fantasy elements to this. Also, like I said, science fiction. We have some high science kind of ideas. But this does feel like a fantasy tale. We have like this really cool kind of pilgrimage with the main ensemble cast of characters as they try to find the cure for this pandemic that's ravaging the rest of the world. They try to find the truth about some of their families or what's going on in this country. And we have this kind of fantasy travel narrative where they're trying to go across the entire country of America and the future they found here. Really a great series. I love it. Cam Coley on artwork just hits it out of the park. This is really the series that introduced me to this incredible illustrator. I already love Scott Snyder and Charles Soule, and I think that this is just such a fun collaboration. I've been following this series for a couple years now. I just finished reviewing the 4th trade paperback, but I love this book. I think for fantasy fans out there, especially contemporary fantasy, there's a lot to love here. Like I said, it's at a cross-section of a few different genres, but it really works to me. I love Undiscovered Country. Next on the list, and this series is a trip, of course I'm going to be talking about I Hate Fairyland by Scottie Young. I Hate Fairyland is an Image Comics series that was contained for a while, but they actually revived this series, I think, recently. I've only read bits of it here, but I love this first trade paperback collection. The art from Scottie Young here in particular, well, I do like his written work as well. The illustrations in this book absolutely sell me on the title. There is this kind of charming, cartoony aspect to this work, but we have this incredible amount of violence and kind of vulgarity in the midst of that, and it's just a shocking juxtaposition. We basically have this young girl who gets trapped in this fantastical land, kind of think like the land of Oz maybe is a good analog. She gets trapped there as a little girl in this fairyland, and at first it starts great, but she finds that she's not able to complete this quest and return home to her normal life. And in this fantasy world, she never ages. She always looks like a little girl, and she's come to hate Fairyland. This was once a kind of stereotypical dream fantasy narrative for a young girl, but it's become her waking nightmare. She can't escape, she can't die, and she hates Fairyland. And this is her quest to kind of get rid of everyone in her way and try to finally get home. It really does poke a lot of fun at kind of that young Wizard of Oz kind of storytelling, or just any kind of young girl fantasy story. The character is really fun to like. Supporting cast of characters and villains are all interesting. I think it pokes fun at a lot of these tropes, and it's in itself already kind of a fun fantasy story. This art in this book, I just really love it. Like I said, there's a cartoony aspect to it, but there is some violence and intensity, and it just has a lot going for it. I really like what I've read of this series as well. Love Scottie Young's art. It's absolutely beautifully showcased here. The coloring just jumps right off the page. I mean, you've seen it for yourself as I flip through. A really vibrant, lively series that is a fun fantasy at its core. Okay, moving right along in our fantasy comic recommendation list, I'm going to be talking about Birthright by Joshua Williamson. This is another Image Comics great. I've really enjoyed making my way through this series in recent years. This is a straight-up fantasy story as well. There's a lot of contemporary fantasy elements to it that I just thoroughly enjoy. The central premise of this is that a family, a husband, a wife, and 2 young sons, on basically the eve of one of the sons' birthdays, he's playing catch with his dad by the woods. He goes past the tree line to fetch his ball and completely disappears, much to the horror of the rest of the family. And then a year or 2 later, the family kind of disintegrates, the marriage disintegrates, and all of a sudden this burly, muscular man shows up claiming to be the lost little boy. He says that in that 1 or 2 calendar years, he actually had his whole upbringing and adolescence and early manhood in this fantastical world where time moves differently, and he saved that fantasy world from this horrible evil, and now he's back on Earth because he believes some of that evil escaped into this realm. It's not only an interesting story that talks about kind of a broken family and trying to repair old relationships, but it also has a fun blend of fantasy, both as fantastical elements invade, air quotes, our world, but also flashbacks that show his coming of age in this pure fantasy realm. We have a lot of great fantasy world building here, a lot of great character actions and interactions. I love the central premise. I think it's haunting and amazing at the same time. I think this family is fascinating. I think the whole setup is really great. I really enjoyed Williamson from his work on Batman and some of his other stuff at DC, and to have him in this fantasy series over at Image, his own creator-owned property here, it is a really good piece of work. I think if you've enjoyed some of his DC stuff, definitely check out this fantasy series. I think it's fantastic. I think it's amazing we haven't had any kind of complete collection or hardcovers or anything for this yet. Hopefully one day we will. We've done a lot of work here from the indie or smaller publishers in the comic book world, but I wanted to go with some of the mainstreams here. We're going to be talking about Dark Ages by Tom Taylor over at Marvel Comics. I did a review for this series some time ago on the channel. I thoroughly enjoyed this. Essentially, this takes place in another kind of dystopian future, this time within the Marvel Universe. There is an event that happens that basically plunges the world into a blackout. Civilization in general has come to a screaming halt. They've degraded, and now we have these kind of tribal factions of groups and survivors in this new world. And we have a lot of the Marvel heroes kind of banding together to kind of keep the world moving forward, to deal with these existing threats and some of the villains that are still around. There are so many great twists and turns. This feels like a kind of dystopian future, but it has a lot of fantastical elements. There is what I feel like some fantasy storytelling here as the world becomes something new. There's a kind of epically scope to this as we have this kind of survival narrative as well. And frankly, it's giving Tom Taylor an opportunity to do something I think he does so well, which is to play in his own sandbox within an already established universe. What do I mean by that? One of the first things I read from Tom Taylor was actually parts of Injustice, where he basically got a sandbox of this total alternate reality DC universe where he was able to make an evil Superman and Batman trying to stop him in this whole other dystopian world. I've also read stuff he's done like Deceased, which is kind of the DC Zombies universe. I think he just has such a commanding grasp for the voice of a lot of these major characters, and this is him doing something like that on Marvel. We get to see a dystopian future, kind of fantasy landscape that basically he just gets to set the stage however he wants. This is a self-contained little mini-series. We don't have a ton of sequels for this at the time. I don't know if they're going to revisit this, but I loved it. I think it's kind of underrated. I think there's so many Tom Taylor fans out there, especially because of his tenure on Nightwing, but I think that this is kind of an undiscovered gem. It's not perfect. I do prefer things like Injustice or Deceased, but if you're a big Marvel fan like me, it's fun to see Tom Taylor give this whole sandbox effect to the Marvel Universe. Next up, we have Wonder Woman by George Perez. This is one of the most iconic and recognizable runs on the Wonder Woman title, and frankly, it was one of my earliest Wonder Woman reads after the Brian Azzarello and Cliff Chiang run in New 52. It's a lot of fun. This is post-crisis, I believe, and we're basically given a really kind of Greek and Roman mythologically heavy Wonder Woman story narrative. We get kind of the foundational stories of her time on Themyscira, the paradise island of the Amazons, and I think it's just a really well done story. The art is classic to the time. I think it's really beautifully done, and I like the stories we get here. Like I said, it's kind of like a Wonder Woman origin retelling and kind of an establishment of that paradise island, Themyscira, and I think because of that, I classify this as a fantasy-heavy book, and I really love it. This is definitely a major big two title, Marvel or DC, and I think if you're a fan of Wonder Woman or been interested in this character and you like things like Roman or Greek mythology, I think that this run has a lot to offer you. This is kind of an oversized paperback collection. They've done this run in Omnibus, things like that, but this is the collection I have. This is a volume 1, and I am a fan of George Perez, so I think that this was just a blast. What I've read from it, I've really enjoyed, and I think that it leans, again, more on those mythological roots of these characters, or at least kind of the homage and how this character was formulated. And I just think it works. It's a fun book. I wanted to recommend a couple on this list that are big too, so I had to include this Wonder Woman run. And hey, if you're enjoying this video and you have yet to subscribe to the channel, I just want to encourage you to do so. I'm always doing top 10 lists, comic book reviews, unboxings, haul videos, and so much more. Thank you for considering. Now back to the list. Next up on our list, we have Jonathan Hickman's Secret Wars. If you're not aware of this is not only a culmination of his time on works like Fantastic Four and Avengers, but also a couple other comic book runs. It is a masterpiece. It is kind of a swan song for this era of Hickman-based Marvel books. But honestly, I actually think Secret Wars can also be read as a standalone. You might have to fill in a few gaps, but I do think this story really works. For my money, it is one of my favorite Marvel comic events of all time. Why I consider it a fantasy, just basic premise without spoiling too much here. Essentially, Doctor Doom is sort of a world ruler of this kind of hodgepodge put together fantasy kind of world. We have a lot of pre-existing Marvel characters in this world run by Doom with no memory of any prior world or universe, and within this world we have these kind of arcs show up with heroes and villains from the Marvel universe who remember what it was like book before. They try to topple Doctor Doom and restore the universe, but things happen, and I won't spoil it for you, but this is kind of a multiversal epic, and we have a lot of fantastic character interactions that you're not going to see anywhere else. The art on this book is provided largely by the incredible Esad Ribic. He's also done work on things like Jason Aaron's Thor, the modern Eternals run that came out recently, and his illustrations, in my mind, really just serve the fantasy genre well. There's this kind of pastel quality to it. A lot of this detail work feels larger than life, but also kind of surreal or dreamy. There is this mythic quality to it. I just love it, and I think the artist for this was pitch perfect for everything Hickman was trying to do here. This is a fantastic story. I think if you're a fan of Doctor Doom, some of the Fantastic Four characters, or just love the Marvel Universe or multiverse in general, definitely don't sleep on Marvel's Secret Wars. Okay, I could not do a comic book fantasy recommendation video without talking about Jeff Smith's Bone. Now, admittedly, I still am making my way through this epic. I have the entire collection in this one big black and white volume. I know they also have trade paperback collections, some they've even colorized, but I love this book. This is truly an epic in every sense of the word, and in my mind, it's kind of a cross between kind of newspaper, comic book, cartoony, fun action, and a Lord of the Rings style epic storytelling. There are some great sword and sorcery fantasy elements in this book. There's a lot of great humor. I think all of the main characters are fantastic. I love the art style. Like I said, it's very cartoony and basic in many ways, especially with the main kind of bone-derived characters. The other characters that look more human in this fantasy world, it's also just a really fun juxtaposition. This book makes you laugh. It makes you get a little misty-eyed maybe. I really just thoroughly enjoyed it. I think that this is a great book to pick up and read a little bit at a time. It is a total quest travel narrative as well. Like I said, if you're a fan of something like Lord of the Rings and you like kind of cartoon animation style in general, this might be a must read. I think this is also suitable for younger audiences, but it has the kind of all ages quality I really love and just am generally impressed by. Jeff Smith really has a commanding grasp of this format. I love what he's done with the comic book medium. I think I've reviewed a Shazam book he did on the channel. I haven't done a review on this yet. As I mentioned, I'm still going through it, but I thoroughly love it. You can find it, like I said, in a couple different volumes. I prefer this all in one. It's a great way to experience the breadth of this story. It's such a big breadth of story that, again, I'm still making my way through it, but I really dig it. In the future, as I finish it up, if you'd like to see a review on this channel, definitely let me know. I'd love to hear if you're reading this or have read it in the past. Anyway, don't miss out on Jeff Smith's Bone. Next up on our top fantasy comic book series list, we have Excalibur Omnibus Volume 1 from Marvel Comics. There were so many creators, both writers and illustrators on this book, but Chris Claremont's definitely a name near the top for me. This is a fantastic omnibus. I am still finishing this one out as well, but from what I've read, it's still worth throwing on this list. I will say this omnibus has a bit of an uneven quality as far as the caliber of stories included, at least from my reading thus far. I think when it hits hard and it's amazing, and there's some plot lines that I think are a little meandering or kind of go on for a little too long. But the central premise here I really enjoy. It's kind of an X-Men derivative book, and it's a really eclectic mix of characters. We have some of the kind of Euro English superheroes, like we have Captain Britain and his paramour Megan, teaming up with Rachel Summers, the Phoenix. We have Kitty Pryde, Shadowcat, and Nightcrawler. There are a couple others that show up here and there, but this is the core team at the beginning of Excalibur, and I find this book really fascinating. It's a really interesting superhero team book that feels a little bit different. They're not only solving threats here in our world, but also in the kind of mythical other world that Captain Britain is also a protector of, and I really like the storytelling here. Captain Britain really leans on a lot of the fantastical ideas, genres, elements, and I think that there's some really rich storytelling with that here. This earlier era Claremont X-Men period, I'm really interested in so many of the books he does, and because this feels like an X-Men offshoot book mixed in with some of those British comics, it's a really fun cross-section. Like I said, this comic feels like an amalgam of so many things in one, but I think it's firmly in the fantasy genre, mixing that with the superhero genre, I would say, but a really fun book. Love the art throughout it. I know I've read some modern Excalibur runs as well, but this early one here, well, it's just something special. And rounding out our list today, we have another omnibus here with Thor by Jason Aaron, Omnibus Volume 1. I mentioned this earlier in the video. This was written by largely Jason Aaron and illustrated by so many amazing creators, including the great Esad Ribic that I talked about in the Jonathan Hickman Secret Wars entry on this video. This is a fantastic Thor run. I'm still reading this as well. Wow, have I said that enough? It turns out I haven't done a good job finishing a lot of these fantasy series quite yet, but wow, am I enjoying the rides. And that's definitely true here with Jason Aaron's Thor. This is celebrated as maybe one of the most, if not the most popular modern Thor run. I've heard almost resoundingly from a lot of the internet and a lot of reviewers out there. I'm personally really digging it. I also enjoyed Matt Fraction's run, and there's a couple other modern Thor runs I'm hoping to get a hands on this year if I can. But this is really great storytelling. I think when you're dealing with Thor, you're dealing with a lot of that kind of Norse mythology and those characters that just scream fantasy. Because we have the 9 realms as well, there's so many rich kind of fantastical landscapes that Thor's stories can be unfolded across, let alone everything within the Marvel Universe in general. I think for fans of mythology, I think that Thor has a lot to offer them, and Jason Aaron's Thor in particular is a lot of fun. Earlier in this run as well, we have Thor kind of creating his own fellowship, kind of like the Lord of the Rings, where we have all of these different species of just kind of fantasy characters like elves and dark elves and goblins and giants and so forth. It is a really fun book. I really like that it is a good mix of straight up fantasy storytelling and every so often kind of the caped heroic superhero genre. I do like that Thor is kind of standing 2 feet in both worlds there between superhero genre and straight up fantasy. I think that this is a really great way to explore the Marvel Universe, but also feel like you're getting more than the traditional New York-based Marvel adventures. This goes to totally different realms, and it's a ton of fun. I think it's great for fantasy lovers in general. And that's going to do it today for our list of 10 comic books for fantasy readers. I wanted again to do a recommendations-based comic book listing based on a subgenre. I do like the fantasy genre in general, and I've been really elated to see comic books take a crack at it. I tried to mix in a lot of good indie or smaller publishers here. One, because I feel like I've really enjoyed their fantasy storytellings, but also just to get some more creative-owned work recommended on the channel. Also, if you've been following for a while, I am a huge fan of the big two, Marvel and DC, but every so often I like to venture a bit further off the beaten path with some of these other publishers. And for a lot of my viewers out there, I know you're also fans of the big two, but there are other publishers out there that have some really great titles here. I know I've missed a bunch of fantasy recommendations, so if you have a favorite comic book series or 3 that are in that fantasy genre or could be, recommend them in the comments. I would love the comment section to just scream great comic book recommendations. Thank you all for watching so much once again. I love hearing from you in the comments, love the feedback. And once again, this has been the Comic Book Report. Please don't forget to leave your like, comment, and maybe share this video with a friend. Thanks for watching and have a good one.